What if the man sleeping beside you every night whispered his deepest secrets in a language he thought you could never understand? And what if every single word he spoke in those private, unguarded moments was slowly, beautifully, painfully building a love story you never expected? What if silence was not your weakness, but your greatest strength? What if understanding everything, his fears, his confessions, his midnight prayers, his broken apologies spoken to no one, made you fall more deeply in love with him than any romantic dinner ever could? What if the secret you were keeping was not a lie, but actually the most romantic act of your entire life? Stay with me, because this story will change the way you think about love, language, silence, and the extraordinary courage it takes to love someone completely, even when they don't know you can hear every word of their soul. My husband doesn't know I speak his language. What if the most romantic thing you ever did for love was simply to listen, to truly, deeply, secretly listen, while the entire world assumed you were sitting quietly in beautiful ignorance? I learned Italian in the basement of a small bookshop in London, 3 years before I ever boarded a plane to Rome, 3 years before I ever met the man who would become the center of my entire universe, 3 years before love decided to arrive in my life, wearing a linen shirt and carrying a worn leather notebook. I learned it because I fell in love with Italian poetry first, with Dante, with Leopardi, with the way the language curved around emotion like water around a stone, smooth and inevitable and ancient. I learned it the way you learn something that feels like destiny, not for any practical reason, not for travel or career or necessity, but simply because some languages call to your soul before your mind has any logical explanation for the attraction. What if that quiet obsession with a foreign language was actually the universe preparing you for a love you had not yet imagined? I met Lorenzo at a mutual friend's gallery opening in Florence, where I had been living for 8 months on a writing fellowship that I had convinced myself was purely professional, but was actually a desperate search for something I could not name. He was standing near a painting of a winter sea, holding a glass of red wine with the careless confidence of a man completely comfortable in his own silence, and he was speaking rapidly in Italian to the gallery owner about the particular quality of light in the painting, about how the artist had managed to capture the exact color of grief. And I understood every single word he said, and I felt my heart shift in my chest like furniture being rearranged in a room that had been too empty for too long. Romance, in that first electric moment, was not a touch or a smile or a whispered compliment. It was standing 3 feet away from a stranger and understanding his soul before he even knew your name existed. It was hearing him describe grief as a color and feeling your own grief respond like a chord struck on an instrument you forgot you were carrying. It was the breathless, terrifying, magnificent sensation of being seen by someone who was not even looking at you yet, of being known by someone who did not know you existed, of falling into a conversation you were not technically part of, but that felt more intimate than any conversation you had ever deliberately entered. My hands trembled slightly around my own wine glass. The winter sea in the painting looked back at me with perfect understanding. We were introduced minutes later by our mutual friend, Chiara, who told Lorenzo in Italian that I was an English writer who spoke no Italian at all, and I watched his face perform a small, polite adjustment, the universal expression of someone deciding to switch languages for a guest. And he turned to me and said in beautiful, careful English, "The painting makes me think of things I have lost." And I smiled and said, "Me too." And neither of us said anything more for a moment, and in that shared silence, something was already beginning that neither of us had words for yet in any language. What if the lie you never technically told became the foundation of the most honest love you had ever known? I never corrected Chiara's introduction. I never announced my Italian. In the beginning, it was simply awkward timing. The moment passed too quickly, and then we were talking about other things, and then we were exchanging numbers, and then we were meeting for coffee the following Tuesday. And by then, the secret had a small, warm life of its own, and I told myself I would reveal it soon. I would find the right moment. I would laugh about it and explain, and everything would be perfectly fine. But the right moment kept refusing to arrive, and meanwhile, something else was arriving, something enormous and terrifying and wonderful, and I was too busy being overwhelmed by it to think carefully about language or timing or the small deception that was quietly growing roots in the soil of everything we were building together. Romance, in those early weeks, was a language lesson I gave only to myself. It was sitting across from him at a small table outside a cafe near the Arno, listening to him answer a phone call in Italian, his voice dropping half an octave when he spoke his mother tongue, his hands moving differently, his face losing the careful English-speaking composure and becoming something more fluid and unguarded and real, and understanding every word, understanding that he was telling his mother he had met someone, understanding the hesitation in his voice that was not reluctance but tenderness, understanding that he said, "She makes me feel like the windows are open," and that this was the most romantic thing anyone had ever said about me in any language. And sitting there with my cafe latte growing cold in my hands, smiling at the river because I could not look at him without my face revealing everything. What if you heard someone love you in secret before before they ever said the words to your face. He told me he loved me first in Italian. He did not know he was telling me. We had been together 4 months, and we were in his apartment late on a Thursday night, and I was pretending to read while he sat at his desk writing in his notebook. And he paused and looked out the window at the dark street below and said quietly, almost to himself, almost to the night, Dio, come ti amo. God, how I love you. And the book in my hands became suddenly impossible to hold, and I pressed my face against the cover and breathed very carefully and methodically until I was certain I could control my expression. And when he turned around, I was reading again, or performing the act of reading, and he smiled at me with the soft, unguarded smile of a man who believes he is safely alone with his feelings. And I smiled back with the controlled smile of a woman who has just received the most precious gift of her life and must somehow pretend she found it somewhere else. Romance, in that breathless Thursday night moment, was the extraordinary discipline of containing joy so large it threatened to break through your skin. It was the almost painful sweetness of being loved in secret, of holding someone else's unguarded truth gently in your hands, like a bird that has landed there by mistake and might fly away if you breathe too suddenly. It was understanding that he would tell me properly, in English, when he was ready, and that waiting for that moment while already knowing was its own kind of beautiful torture, like knowing the ending of a story, but choosing to keep reading every single page anyway, because the journey deserved your complete attention and your willing, deliberate presence on every step of the path. What if knowing everything made you love him more carefully, more completely, more honestly than ignorance ever could have allowed? I learned things about him in Italian that he was not ready to tell me in English. I learned that he was afraid of becoming his father, a man who had been brilliant and driven and emotionally absent, a man who had loved his family in theory but been too distracted by ambition to love them in practice. I learned this from a phone call he had with his younger sister, standing on our balcony on a Sunday morning, thinking I was still asleep, his voice low and urgent and honest, in the way voices only become in their native tongue, saying that he wanted to be different, that he was trying, that he thought maybe this time he had found someone who made him want to be present, actually present, not just physically there, but genuinely, completely, attentively there. I lay in bed listening and felt the complicated weight of being someone's hope, and I decided silently, completely, permanently, that I would never give him a reason to be afraid of becoming absent, because he was already fighting that fear for me, and that was the bravest and most romantic thing I had ever witnessed. Romance, in that Sunday morning moment, was eavesdropping on someone's most private battle and choosing to become part of their victory. It was understanding that love is not just the beautiful parts, the candlelit dinners and the stolen kisses and the grand gestures that photograph well, but also the private negotiations a person has with their own worst fears, the conversations they have with their siblings at 8 in the morning about the kind of person they are desperately trying to become. It was realizing that witnessing someone's struggle, truly witnessing it without their knowledge or performance, was the most intimate form of love that existed, more intimate than any physical closeness, more revealing than any deliberately shared confession, more bonding than any planned romantic moment could ever manufacture or arrange. What if the language barrier you never actually had was protecting something so fragile and so precious that breaking it too soon would have shattered everything before it had time to become strong? We married in October, in a small ceremony in the hills outside Florence, with his family and mine and Chiara crying loudly and happily in the front row. His mother spoke to me in careful, slow Italian throughout the entire reception, believing I understood nothing, and I understood everything. I understood her telling his aunt that she had never seen her son look at anyone the way he looked at me. I understood her prayer spoken quietly while holding my hands, asking God to keep me safe because her son would not survive losing me. And I held her hands and looked into her eyes and loved her completely and silently and desperately. And she patted my cheek with the tender authority of a woman who has decided to claim you as her own, regardless of language or geography or the small technicalities of cultural difference. Romance, on that October wedding day, was understanding every blessing spoken over you in a language you were pretending not to know, and feeling those blessings settle into your bones like warmth settling into cold hands, and knowing that love had traveled across every language barrier that existed to find you, and that it had found you completely, and that you were home in a way that had nothing to do with geography and everything to do with the particular quality of his voice when he said your name in English, and the particular quality of his silence when he sat beside you and needed nothing from you except your presence. What if the secret you were keeping was not protecting you? It was protecting him, protecting the space where he could be most honestly, most vulnerably, most beautifully himself. I heard him cry once. We had been married 14 months, and his father had died unexpectedly on a cold February morning, and I held him through the English grief, the phone calls, the logistics, the stoic arrangements, and then, at midnight, I lay beside him in the dark and listened to him grieve in Italian, in whispers whispers, in the language where his relationship with his father had actually lived, in the language of childhood and old wounds and complicated love. And I did not speak. I did not translate myself into his grief. I simply lay beside him and breathed steadily and let him have the privacy of his mother tongue while giving him the comfort of my presence. And somewhere in that balance, in that particular combination of witnessing and respecting, I understood that this was what marriage actually was. Not the ceremony or the photographs or the shared address, but this, being present for someone's most private pain without requiring them to perform it in a language designed for your comfort. Romance, in that February midnight darkness, was the radical and revolutionary act of making room. It was understanding that love sometimes means creating space for someone to be broken in their own particular way, in their own particular language, without rushing to translate their grief into something more comfortable for you to witness and manage and resolve. It was lying beside someone in the dark and being nothing more and nothing less than a warm, breathing, steady reminder that the world had not ended, that morning would come, that they were not alone in the universe, even when the universe felt most cold and most indifferent and most ruthlessly efficient in its capacity for loss. What if love is not about being understood? What if love is about choosing to understand every single day in every single language, including the ones nobody ever taught you? The day I finally told him was an ordinary Tuesday, almost 2 years into our marriage. He was on the phone with his sister, laughing about something from their childhood, and he said, not for the first time, but for the first time I decided to respond. He said in Italian, "She is the best thing that ever happened to me, and I don't even have the words to explain it properly in any language." And I walked into the kitchen where he was standing, and I said, in Italian, quietly and clearly, and with 2 years of accumulated love in every syllable, "Anch'io, me too." The phone call ended. I am not certain he remembered ending it. He stood very still and looked at me with an expression I had never seen on his face before. Not quite shock, not quite betrayal, not quite laughter, but some extraordinary combination of all three moving rapidly across his features like weather crossing an open field. And then he said, in Italian, his voice barely working properly, "How long?" And I said, in Italian, "Before we met." And he sat down slowly at the kitchen table, as if his legs had made a unilateral decision about the situation, and I sat across from him and waited. Romance, in that Tuesday kitchen revelation, was the most frightening and most exhilarating moment of my entire life. More frightening than the first time he held my hand, more exhilarating than the first time he kissed me, more intimate than our wedding night, more vulnerable than any moment that had come before it. Because I was not just revealing a secret, I was revealing the entire architecture of how I had loved him, the secret library I had been building for 2 years, every Italian word he had ever spoken in my presence, suddenly rearranging itself between us into a map of everything we actually were to each other, beneath the careful English surface of our daily life together. He reached across the table and took my face in both his hands, the way you hold something you are terrified of dropping, and he looked at me for a very long time with those dark eyes that I had been watching for 2 years in both languages. And then he laughed, a real laugh, a full laugh, the kind of laugh that lives at the exact intersection of disbelief and joy. And then he was not laughing anymore, and he said in Italian, softly and completely and without any performance whatsoever, "You heard everything." "Yes," I said, in Italian. "Dio come ti amo," he said, the same words, the Thursday night words, the words I had been holding carefully for nearly 2 years. "I know," I said. "I've known for a very long time, and I have always, in every language, felt exactly the same." Conclusion. This story is ultimately not about language or secrets or the delightful shock of a 2-year revelation in a Tuesday morning kitchen. It is about the extraordinary, courageous, deeply romantic act of truly listening to another person, of paying close enough attention to understand not just what they say, but who they actually are beneath every careful, socially appropriate, publicly presentable version of themselves they offer to the world. Real love is always a secret language. It exists in the spaces between spoken words, in the midnight whispers people offer to empty rooms, in the prayers they say to nobody, in the confessions they make to paintings in galleries before they know your name. The most romantic thing you can do for another person is to learn their language, not the one their country gave them, but the private, particular, irreplaceable language of who they actually are when nobody is watching and nothing needs to be performed.